The army that shouldn't have won did. And the decision that made it happen wasn't made on the day of the battle. It wasn't made in a war council or in a king's throne room or over maps spread across a candlelit table. It was made in silence, in mud, on a cold hillside, days before a single sword was drawn, by a man history almost forgot, standing alone in the dark, looking down at a road and seeing something no one else could see. This is the story of two geniuses, two commanders, two completely different minds, one shaped by power, wealth, and the certainty that comes from never having lost. The other shaped by necessity, patience, and a kind of intelligence that doesn't announce itself loudly, but waits quietly for exactly the right moment. And in part one, we are not going to talk about the fighting. Not yet, because the real battle, the one that actually decided everything, happened before the armies ever met. It happened in the days and weeks before November 15th, 1315. It happened on the slopes of a mountain called Morgarten. And it happened inside two very different minds, making two very different choices about the same piece of ground. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the battlefield was already won before anyone arrived. And in part two, we will watch it burn. Let's begin. To understand what happened to Morgarten, you have to understand the world these men were born into. In that world, the Europe of the early 14th century was nothing like the stable, bordered continent we know today. It was a place of overlapping loyalties, crumbling empires, and constant renegotiation of who had the right to rule whom. The Holy Roman Empire, that vast, complicated, frequently dysfunctional collection of kingdoms and principalities that stretched from the North Sea to the Italian peninsula, was fracturing. The emperors who were supposed to hold it together were increasingly unable to do so. Local lords were growing stronger. Old powers were being challenged. And at the western edge of the Alps, in a rugged triangle of land that most powerful men barely thought about, something quietly extraordinary was happening. The Swiss cantons, small, semi-independent communities of farmers, herdsmen, and craftsmen, were beginning to organize. They had been doing so for decades, quietly and carefully, signing mutual defense agreements, refusing to simply accept Habsburg authority over their valleys and passes. They were not an army. They were not a nation, not yet. But there was something perhaps more dangerous, a people who had decided, collectively, that they were done being controlled. This did not sit well with the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs were, at this moment in history, the most ambitious and aggressive dynasty in Central Europe. They had been expanding their territory for generations, buying land here, marrying into it there, seizing it when they had to. Their power base was Austria, but their ambitions stretched in every direction. And the Swiss mountain passes were, to them, not just political irritants. They were strategic corridors. Whoever controlled those passes controlled movement between the German north and the Italian south. And that meant money, troops, and power. Duke Leopold I of Austria was the man the Habsburgs sent to solve the Swiss problem once and for all. And Leopold was not a stupid man. Let's be very clear about that. He was educated, politically experienced, and militarily trained in the tradition of his dynasty. He had fought before. He had commanded men before. He understood war in the way that a 14th century nobleman understood war, as a matter of superior force, well-organized logistics, and the psychological weight of a powerful name. What he did not understand, what he had perhaps never needed to understand, was the land itself. Leopold assembled his army in the autumn of 1315, and it was, by any reasonable measure of the era, an impressive force. Historians estimate somewhere between 5,000 and 9,000 men, though the precise numbers remain debated. What is not debated is the composition. This was a heavy cavalry force, armored knights on armored horses, the most expensive and lethal military technology of the medieval period. These were professional warriors, men who had trained their entire lives for this, men whose horses alone cost more than a Swiss farmer would earn in a decade. He also had infantry, crossbowmen, foot soldiers, but the knights were the heart of his force. They were his statement. They were his argument. Look at what I have brought. Look at the weight of what rides toward you. Now surrender. This was how the Habsburgs had always done it, and had always worked. Leopold's plan for the campaign was, in essence, a march. He would move his column north through the valley that ran alongside Lake Adjari, push through the narrow mountain pass at Morgarten, emerge on the other side into the Swiss heartland, and force a decisive confrontation. Speed was important. He wanted to move before the Swiss could fully organize, before winter made the passes truly treacherous, and before any political complications could slow him down. It was a direct plan, a confident plan. It was also a plan made by a man who had never walked that road. Now we meet the other mind in this story. William of Huntenburg is one of those figures who sits in the gap between history and legend. The Swiss chronicles of the era mention him, but not with the exhaustive detail we would wish for. What we can reconstruct from military records, geographical analysis, and the logic of what actually happened is a portrait of a commander who thought in a fundamentally different way from Leopold. Where Leopold thought about force, Huntenburg thought about space. Where Leopold counted soldiers, Huntenburg counted slopes. Where Leopold planned a campaign as a sequence of movements, Huntenburg planned it as a sequence of conditions, specific situations he would create into which he would invite his enemy, and from which his enemy could not escape. He was, in the most precise sense of the word, a strategist. Not in the modern textbook sense. He had no formal military academy, no centuries of doctrine to draw on. His strategy was built from something older and more immediate. It was built from knowledge of the land he had lived on his entire life. In the weeks before Leopold's army began its march, Huntenburg was moving. Not with a large force. That would have been noticed, and noticed badly. He moved with small groups, sometimes alone, walking the routes that he knew Leopold would have to use. He was not just looking at the terrain. He was stress testing it. He was asking questions of the landscape that Leopold hadn't thought to ask. How wide is this road at its narrowest point? Wide enough for 2 horses abreast, perhaps 3. No more. What happens to the road when it rains, and it had been raining? It becomes soft. Heavy horses sink. Movement slows. Where does the slope above the road begin, and how steep is it? Steep enough that a man on foot, wearing no armor, moving quickly downhill, has enormous momentum. Steep enough that a knight in full plate, trying to climb it against resistance, is almost helpless. And then the question that would change everything: what is above that slope? What is on that ridge? Trees. Dense old forest. Invisible from the road below. Perfect cover for several hundred men to stand completely undetected for hours, even days, if they were careful and quiet. Huntenburg stood on that ridge. He looked down at the road. He looked at the lake on the other side, cold, wide, impassable. He looked at the walls of the valley, and he understood something with complete clarity. This place was not just good ground for defense. This place was a funnel, a channel, a corridor so perfectly constrained by nature that an army entering it would be geometrically incapable of using its numerical advantage. You could have 100,000 men. Once you were in that corridor, only the first 3 could fight. He had found his battlefield, but choosing the ground was only the beginning. The harder work, the work that required not just intelligence, but extraordinary organizational discipline, was preparing it. Because Huntenburg's plan was not simply to ambush Leopold's column. Any competent commander could set an ambush. His plan was to make the ambush so total, so overwhelming in its first moments, that the psychological shock alone would do half the work for him. He began placing his men in the tree line above the road. Not all at once, too obvious, too risky. In small groups, over several nights, moving silently in the dark, lying still in the cold. These were not professional soldiers in Leopold's sense. They were men of the cantons, farmers who had trained together, herdsmen who knew every fold of this mountain. They were not trained in the intricate maneuvers of cavalry warfare. They didn't need to be. Huntenburg had designed a battle that required none of that. What he needed from them was stillness, patience, and, when the moment came, controlled fury. He also needed weapons. And here is where the genius of the plan reaches something almost poetic in its simplicity. Huntenburg's men had halberds, long pole weapons with an axe head and a spike, devastating against armored cavalry at close range because they could hook a knight from his horse and drive through the gaps in plate armor. These were the standard weapons of Swiss infantry and would become legendary across the coming centuries precisely because of what happened at Morgarten and battles like it. But Huntenburg had something else in mind for the opening of the battle. Something that required no training at all. Something that the mountain itself had been providing for centuries. Rocks. He had his men gather boulders and logs, drag them to the ridge, stack them, position them at the top of the slope above the narrowest, most confined section of the road. These are not catapults. There was no engineering involved. This was simple, brutal physics. Put a large rock at the top of a steep slope above a narrow road packed with armored horses and riders, and let gravity do what gravity does. When those rocks came down, they would not be stopped by armor. They would not be outmaneuvered by cavalry. They would crash through the column with a force that no training or discipline could prepare a man to respond to. And in the chaos that followed, the screaming horses, the fallen men, the blocked road, the complete inability to move forward or backward efficiently. Huntenburg's men would descend from a slope. That was the plan. That was the trap. And it was ready. Now let's look at what Leopold was doing during all of this, because the contrast is almost painful to observe. Leopold's intelligence about the Swiss dispositions was poor. This was partly his own fault. He had not invested adequately in scouting this specific route, and partly a function of the era. Medieval commanders often had surprisingly limited information about enemy movements, relying on local informants who might be bribed, confused, or simply wrong. There were whispers. There were vague reports of Swiss forces moving in the hills above Morgarten. But the nature of those movements, the scale, the positioning, the intent was not understood. More critically, Leopold did not take those whispers seriously enough to change his plan. And this is where we see the other face of his character. Not stupidity, but a particular kind of overconfidence that is almost more dangerous. The overconfidence of a man who has never been seriously challenged. The overconfidence of a dynasty that has always gotten what it wanted. The Swiss cantons were not, in Leopold's mental model, capable of sophisticated tactical planning. They were peasants and herders defending their villages. They might ambush a patrol. They might delay a column briefly, but they could not, in his estimation, threaten a properly organized and properly armed force of Habsburg knights in any serious way. This was not an irrational belief, given the military paradigms of the era. Heavy cavalry had been the dominant force in European warfare for centuries. The whole structure of feudal military power was built around it. There was almost no historical precedent in 1315 for a force of Swiss infantry defeating a heavy cavalry column of this size in open engagement. Leopold was not ignoring history. He was following it. He just didn't know that history was about to be rewritten. Let's pause here and zoom out, because what is happening in those weeks before Morgarten is not just a military story. It is a story about two entirely different theories of power. Leopold's theory of power was vertical. It came from above, from dynasty, from God, from the weight of armor and the size of armies. It assumed that the world was ordered, that the strong impose their will on the weak, and that the correct response to a problem is to bring overwhelming force to bear on it. This theory had worked for the Habsburgs for generations. It was in many ways the dominant theory of medieval European power. Huntenburg's theory of power was horizontal. It came from knowledge, specific, local, hard-won knowledge of a specific piece of ground. It assumed that the world is not ordered, that the strong can be broken if you find the right angle, and that the correct response to a problem is not more force, but a better understanding of the conditions in which force operates. These two theories were about to collide on a cold November morning, and one of them was about to die. There is one more element of Huntenburg's preparation that deserves attention, because it speaks to something deeper about his character. He knew that the moment the ambush began, the moment the rocks came down and the shouting started, his men would face the most dangerous temptation in all of warfare. The temptation to break, to run, not because they were cowards, but because the chaos of battle is psychologically overwhelming in a way that no training fully prepares you for. Men had broken against lesser things than a charge of Habsburg knights. So Hindenburg did something that is mentioned briefly in the chronicles, but that military historians have pointed to as a sign of real psychological intelligence. He spoke to his men, not in the abstract language of honor and glory. Those were Leopold's words, Habsburg words, words that meant something different to men who were fighting for a dynasty than to men who were fighting for their farms and their valleys and their right to govern themselves. He spoke to them in the language of the ground they were standing on. He pointed to the slope. He explained, in plain terms, what was going to happen. He told them where to stand. He told them what to do when the signal came. He removed, as much as any commander could, the terrifying uncertainty that breaks men in battle. He gave them a specific role in a specific place at a specific moment. And he gave them, more importantly, a reason to believe that the plan would work. Because he had walked this ground. He had tested it. He knew it. And they knew that he knew it. There is a kind of confidence that transfers from a commander to his men, not the loud, performative confidence of a man on horseback waving his sword, but the quiet, technical confidence of a man who has done his homework so thoroughly that doubt has no room to survive. Hindenburg had that, and his men felt it. By the 14th of November, 1315, the night before the battle, the trap was set. Hindenburg's force, numbering somewhere around 1,000 to 1,500 men by most estimates, was hidden in the tree line above the road. The boulders and logs were stacked and ready. The men were cold, lying still in the dark forest, listening to the sounds of the valley below. Leopold's column had made camp nearby. It was a substantial force: knights, infantry, supply wagons. The camp would have had fires, noise, the ordinary sounds of an army settling in for the night. None of them, or almost none of them, knew what was waiting above them in the dark. Think about that contrast for a moment. On one side of the ridge, warmth, noise, certainty, the comfortable weight of Habsburg power. On the other side, silence, cold, patience, and a plan so carefully built that the mountain itself had become part of it. The next morning, Leopold would give the order to march. He would lead his column onto that narrow road beside the lake. He would enter the corridor, and the corridor would close behind him. But before we go there, before part 2, before the rocks fall and the screaming starts and history pivots on a single morning, let's sit for a moment with what these two men have shown us. Leopold showed us what power looks like when it stops asking questions, when it assumes the world will arrange itself to accommodate it, when it mistakes the size of its army for the quality of its understanding. This is not a unique failure. It is perhaps the most common failure of powerful men in every era, the failure of curiosity, the failure to ask, what does the ground actually look like? What does my enemy actually know? What do I know? Hindenburg showed us something rarer and more durable. He showed us that the most important battles are sometimes fought in the mind, in the weeks before the armies meet, in the quiet moments when a man walks a hillside alone and asks the right questions of the right landscape. He had less. He always had less. Fewer men, less armor, less money, less prestige. But he had looked at the world as it actually was. And in the end, that was enough. The echoes of that ground, those slopes, that lake, that narrow road, would reshape the military history of Europe. Not just because of what happened the next morning, but because of what it meant. A new kind of warfare was being born. A warfare that did not belong to the knights and the dynasties. A warfare that belonged to men who knew their land and were willing to defend it with intelligence as much as with force. And it began here, on a cold night in November 1315, with one man standing on a ridge in the dark, looking down at a road, and seeing a trap that his enemy could not imagine existed. Part 2 is where the trap springs, where the rocks fall, where Leopold realizes what has happened, and where Europe begins to understand that something fundamental has changed. Subscribe so you're there when it does. And if this kind of history, the history of minds, of strategy, of the decisions made in silence before the chaos begins, if that speaks to you, then there are dozens more stories waiting for you on this channel. Hit the bell. Leave a comment below telling me which commander from history you think was the greatest strategic mind. I read every one. This has been part 1 of the battle between two geniuses that changed Europe forever. The ground has been chosen. Now we wait for morning.